just use the key. All right, so I am Nick. I was involved with the development of a habitat plan that I'll be discussing today. Ben and a few others have been doing the implementation of that plan over the subsequent years. The plan was really looking at ways to prioritise weed and pest management across the Coorong, Lower Lakes and Murray Mouth region, which is up in the map there. Given the size of the area, over 140,000 hectares, we divided the plan into a Lower Lake section and a Coorong section, and today I'll just talk about the Coorong with the time I have available. So most of you who are familiar with the Coorong-Clim region, and particularly the Coorong, know it's a big area and diverse area. And in turn, there's a whole bunch of threats and issues facing the region. A lot of them are aquatic or water related, but a lot of them are also terrestrial related. There's lots of towns there, for instance. There's lots of weed infestations, lots of roads, tracks, different ownership. I should say that the region we used was not just the defined Clim region. It included a 5 kilometre buffer outside of that area. So it was taking in some privately owned areas. So given those threats and issues, there was a real need to prioritise actions. You could probably spend a lifetime, lots of people's lifetimes, controlling weeds and pests in that area. So we decided to develop a multifaceted approach to prioritise on-ground actions, and which would be achieve things and be likely that they'd actually make a difference. And also, given the Clim program, which funded the work, had a finite lifetime, we wanted to make sure there was things that could be continued into the future by local NRM groups and LAPs and all those kind of organisations that could continue the work of the plan. And also we thought it was important, obviously, to include stakeholder and community consultation in the plan development. It's pointless developing a plan that no one has any ownership or interest in. So that was the rationale for our prioritisation approach. You can see here, this is the map of the Coorong section of the plan. We broke it up into 4 environments. The inland Coorong edge in red there, which is a narrow strip. It's all narrow strip, as you can see on the map, but that's where you're getting different land ownership, roads, and that's Wingate as a point of reference right up the top, that red blotch. Then you've got Young Husband Peninsula in green, the southern Coorong ephemeral wetland system, and then islands. There's 43 islands scattered throughout the Coorong, so they were included as well. I guess one point also to mention that we were focusing on that terrestrial environment. The majority of the weed and pest issues occur in that semi-aquatic or terrestrial habitat associated with the region. And there was 3 main components to our plan, and I'll go through them throughout the talk. So the first one was to identify single species that could warrant targeted control across the region, or both regions. So these were identified through traditional weed and pest risk assessments that some of you would be aware of. So we started with a short list, or started with all the potential weed species known in the region, shortlisted it to ones that could, that obviously having an impact, but also feasible to control. There's a number that are just ubiquitous across the region that there's no chance of controlling, which again you could spend years and years trying to control and not make much difference. And then, as I said, we use standard approaches, expert workshops, consultation with people that know where weeds are and know how to control them, and essentially look to assess the comparative risk of each weed species and also the feasibility of containment. And then in turn, species were allocated to management categories. So briefly, don't worry about too much of the detail here, but this is essentially the risk matrix for weeds and pests. You've got the risk down here and then the feasibility of containment across the top, from no chance to high chance. And then we decided to split with these higher management categories. So ones that should be eradicated, destroyed, and you can contain the spread of the species. We also thought it was important, given the nature of the region, lots of tourists go there for one, water flows downstream, can wash weeds down. That to have an alert category where we listed a range of weeds that aren't in the region yet, but we know there's populations nearby or quite invasive that could spread into the region and have an impact. So, summarising all that, where there were 7 weed species that fell into those 3 categories, 3 top categories, and 1 feral goat, 1 animal pest species that was deemed feasible to control. And we had to sort of mitigate people saying, oh, there's only 1 population or 1 infestation of this weed, this pest, but through this approach they could see, they were involved to start with, and they could see the logic about how we came to decide on which species to target. And throughout the other components of the plan, just because a species didn't fall out on these lists didn't mean that it wasn't feasible or wasn't important to control through other components of the plan. So moving to the second component, which was probably the main focus of the plan, to be honest, and it sort of looked at it from a different perspective. It looked at it identifying high value areas where we could target action, so there'd be less, you get better bang for your buck if you could control an area that was pretty good condition, control weeds and pests in that area and increase its value, as opposed to a completely trashed area that you need to spend a lot of time and effort to get any outcome. So following the Limestone Coast and Coorong Coast, I think it was, action plan, spatial framework that was conducted just as our planning started. We conducted a spatial analysis across the Coorong region, so we divided up into 25 metre by 25 metre cells, had a range, 20, conservation criteria, and they were weighted, and also 9 threat criteria. So conservation criteria were threatened species records, the type of landscape it was, the size of vegetation patches, and various metrics to do with the shape and nativeness, I guess, of those patches. In terms of the threat categories, there was campsites, all the things that you sort of think would pose weed and, well, more so weed threats, roads, and obviously the ownership. If it was within a park, the Coorong National Park, you had a lot better chance, you'd hope, of being able to get it controlled than if it was on a neighbour's fence over the road. And from that, we can produce combined conservation layers, and which I'll show on the next couple of slides, and combined threat layers. They were combined to provide a biodiversity score at that spatial scale. But then we also scaled that up to a manageable size, a management unit. And I'm not sure if I mentioned it on that early slide. We had 83 management units, so that included all of the islands, and we broke up the young husband into maybe 12 management units. And then, so you may think, why have we gone to that detail and then scaled up to a management unit? But that detailed information, which you'll see in some of the maps, hopefully, can then be used to target where you first go out. If you know this is a road through the area, you'll be able to say, well, this is likely to be a hotspot for an infestation. We also mapped off local knowledge, people's knowledge of where weeds and pests were, and that was incorporated into the threat layers as well. So that could guide where implementation started. So unfortunately, the Coorong is not a very good area to show in maps. It's long and skinny. So if you could see in that, but essentially this is the summation of all of those 20 conservation layers. Green being high value conservation or high conservation value, and blue, the colours change throughout the slides too, which probably doesn't help, low value. So I don't know if we can pick anywhere really. You might be able to pick some areas that you know from the area and go, why is that high conservation value? But as I said, it's predominantly to do with the presence of threatened species and remnant vegetation. Moving on to the threat layer, this one's perhaps a bit easier to explain. So red now is high threat and blue is low threat, and the main things that stand out is that long stretch of Young Husband Peninsula has low threat, well, has a low threat value, sorry, I should say. So there's not many threats there. And then you can see right at the top, you can see a bit on Wingate and the roads up there. And then this section near Salt Creek has a different land ownership, and it's got roads through there, and there's a few campgrounds and the like. So it's a high threat area, which is not too surprising. You can kind of see the islands had low threat value as well, given their isolation. So then you combine those two and you get another series of colours. So this one's high, this is the overall biodiversity value. So you get green being high value, red being low value again. So you can see it's starting to pick up those combined layers. And again, young husband is high biodiversity value. It's not too surprising. And a lot of that inner edge is low value. Some interesting patterns down the southern section, and that red is to do, right down the bottom is to do with different land ownership again. And then, so we had that layer, and we can interrogate that layer for a particular management unit. If you average those scores over each of the management units now, if you're following the logic, you can see they get an overall score, and then we can rank them again. Young husband comes out well, and that inside edge and the islands come out well. So from that, we just essentially took the highest priority areas, and they were prioritised. So don't try and look at the last one and think, well, how come that one's in there? But essentially this is, and there is a document with some logic that will explain all that, but there was 12 priority units or clusters, so we decided a majority of those units were on that young husband peninsula, so we decided instead of having 8 units there or whatever, we decided to combine that as one large section. It's similarly hard to access for all of it. So some interesting ones was that little spot down the end of the Coorong National Park there, a couple of the islands, Wild Dog, the pelicans. I named a few. I named at least one island, which was unnamed during the process, after Claire Manning, who was a ranger at Wingate, Lady Clare Island. So there's a few other ones that had real names. And then up the top, there's a couple of heritage areas, Kartu Scrub, which is under Heritage Agreement, Potter's Scrub as well, and also Wingate was a priority area. So that was that part of the process. Then the final component was key invasion sites. So as you can imagine, through an area with high visitation, that's where you're going to get the majority of your disturbance occurring. And as I've mentioned a couple of times, vehicle tracks, campsites. An interesting one for the Coorong is shacks. There was, when we were doing the plan, there was about 101, or exactly 101 I think, shacks which occur throughout the Coorong, which are in various stages of decline. And a lot of people, as you'll see, the example towards the end, planted them up with garden plants, put in trees, exotic trees and a whole bunch of things to make their little shack a nice little area. And attractions, it's not theme parks, but there are historical sites that people visit throughout that Coorong region. Obviously high potential for establishment of weeds, and we also thought it was important to maintain those sites, because that's where visitors were seeing the Coorong or seeing the region. And if it was trashed with weeds or whatever, it wouldn't leave a nice impression. And yeah, we thought that they were at a size that could be targeted and controlled, and perhaps with some education could help to mitigate that risk. So we prioritised, we went through the whole region, identified potential key invasion sites, or I don't think I've ever used this, KISSes. I don't think I ever used that, or we used that during the process, but we'll call them key invasion sites. And then we prioritised them based on their presence in those management units you saw on the previous slide. And we thought that list could change throughout the project. So if one of them was the weed infestation at that site was controlled, that could be struck off the list, other ones put on in order as it was implemented. So to summarise, we developed a prioritisation approach, obviously to target direct weed and pest management in the Coorong and Lower Lakes region, but the principles that could be applied anywhere in South Australia or in Australia really, in different regions. It comes at it, lots of people are used to that single species approach, the biodiversity way is a new way of doing it, and then the key invasion sites also. We also produced a range of detailed action plans for each of the priorities, and lucky the CLIM project planted lots of trees, because there's about 450 pages in both of those volumes of the plans, so we needed a few trees. And just in the time I've got a couple of examples. I'll probably only give one. So this is part of, so that was our involvement, and it's been implemented since that time. Just one example of the implementation. These are the coastal shacks at Barker's Knoll. That if you've ever been down the Coorong fishing or whatever, you'll know them. They're probably good examples of the shacks. They're looked after quite well compared to some of the other ones. They're obviously in that priority biodiversity area of northern Younghusband Peninsula, but they have had plants, garden plants. This is African pig's ear planted here, and a tamarisk and a few other ones planted throughout there. And so it's a manageable little site. There's 11 shacks there. And those weeds had spread out. We did some mapping as part of our project, and then through the implementation, some mapping, and you could see the spread, slow spread. They weren't really invasive species. They were sort of slow spreading species, so it was deemed feasible to control that whole site. And through the implementation, that mapping was complete, and there's been control of all of the main weeds at that site, so around the shacks initially, then also out onto Younghusband Peninsula. So it's been a successful thing. Have I got time for one? All right. The last one, which is quite funny, is the Wingate Biodiversity asset. Up the top, there's a red deer population that some of you may know about. The locals love, but they're having quite an impact on the revegetation. There's been a lot of revegetation on High Marsh Island and Wingate. And there's a remnant Melaleuca swampland you can see down in those corners there. So 3-year program to aerial, you can see the silhouette of the helicopter, aerial survey, and then cull from the air. First year they got 44 red deer controlled. Second year there was none controlled, and there was only 3 observed. I don't know why, maybe they missed on the day, it was windy or whatever. And they're hoping that this year will be the final trip, and they'll be able to cull the last remaining dregs of the population. So, and there's other examples throughout the last 4 or 5 years since the plan was developed. I'll leave it there.